The world exhaled. Markets surged. Oil prices collapsed. World leaders were already drafting their victory statements. And then Netanyahu walked to the podium and said 4 words that changed everything. The ceasefire does not include Lebanon. Within hours Beirut was burning again, and the question that nobody wanted to ask out loud was suddenly impossible to ignore. If there is a ceasefire, then why is the bombing getting worse? That question does not have a simple answer. And the deeper you go into what actually happened over the last 24 hours, the more you realize that what the world is calling a ceasefire and what is actually happening on the ground are 2 very different things. To understand why Netanyahu's statement matters so much, you have to go back to February 28, 2026. That morning the United States and Israel launched coordinated military operations against Iran. On the very first day of those operations, Israel struck the compound of Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Khamenei was killed. That single event marked a point of no return. For decades the conflict between Israel and Iran had been waged through proxies, through shadow operations, through cyber attacks and targeted assassinations. The killing of Khamenei on day 1 signaled that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. Iran's response was immediate and strategically calculated. Within hours of the strikes, Iran moved to close the Strait of Hormuz. That waterway carries roughly 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas trade. Closing it was not just a military move, it was an economic weapon aimed directly at the global economy. Energy markets went into shock. Oil prices reached levels not seen in years. Shipping companies began rerouting away from the Persian Gulf. Asian importers called emergency meetings. European energy ministers scrambled for alternatives. Iran had turned a military conflict into a global economic crisis almost overnight. The war continued for more than 5 weeks. Each week brought new fronts. Hezbollah launched missiles from Lebanon into Israel. Iran-backed groups in Iraq targeted American military positions across the region. Several Gulf Arab nations reported attacks within their borders. What had begun as a bilateral military confrontation had expanded into a multi-front regional war with consequences stretching far beyond the Middle East. On April 7, 2026, President Trump posted a message on Truth Social that sent a shockwave through every capital on Earth. He warned that if Iran did not agree to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and come to the negotiating table by 8 o'clock that evening, a whole civilization would die tonight and never be brought back again. International legal experts immediately flagged the statement as extraordinary. Critics warned that deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure on that scale would constitute a war crime under international law. But the threat was real and the clock was ticking. Markets collapsed as the deadline approached. Emergency diplomatic channels opened across 3 continents. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Army Chief Asim Munir worked the phones throughout the day in what became a frantic last-hour mediation effort. Sharif later said the conversations went through the night and to the very edge of the deadline. Approximately 90 minutes before Trump's self-imposed deadline, the announcement came. Trump posted on Truth Social that Iran had submitted a 10-point proposal and that the United States viewed it as a workable basis for negotiation. He declared a 2-sided ceasefire. The United States and Israel would suspend operations against Iran. Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz for safe passage during the 2-week window. Negotiations would then begin in Islamabad under Pakistani mediation aimed at building a framework for a permanent agreement. The world received the news with visible relief. Oil prices dropped more than 13% within an hour of the announcement. Stock markets recovered sharply. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz called it a moment of hope and said the goal now must be a permanent end to the war. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer welcomed the agreement and called for it to be turned into something lasting. Iranian citizens gathered in Tehran's Enqilab Square well past midnight, celebrating what state media described as a historic achievement for the Iranian people. For a brief window it looked like the worst had been avoided. Hours after the ceasefire announcement, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released a statement that immediately complicated everything. His office confirmed that Israel supports Trump's decision to suspend strikes against Iran. But Netanyahu added a critical qualification. The ceasefire does not include Lebanon, he said. Israel's military operations against Hezbollah would continue. This was not a minor technical footnote. Stopping Israeli strikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon was one of Iran's central demands going into the ceasefire negotiations. Iran and Pakistan's mediating team had both publicly stated that the agreement covered all fronts of the war including Lebanon. Pakistani Prime Minister Sharif had explicitly announced on the record that the ceasefire applied everywhere including Lebanon and elsewhere. Netanyahu followed the strikes with a televised statement that left no room for ambiguity. He said Israel still has objectives to complete and will achieve them either through agreement or through renewed fighting. He said Israel is prepared to return to full combat at any moment required. And then he said the line that defined the entire moment. Our finger remains on the trigger. This is not the end of the campaign but a step along the way to achieving all our objectives. What followed Netanyahu's statement exposed just how fragile and ambiguous the entire agreement actually is. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi posted on social media warning that the United States must choose between ceasefire and continued war through Israel. He wrote that Iran cannot have both and that the world is watching whether Washington will act on its commitments. Iran's Supreme National Security Council issued a warning that its forces remain ready to respond and that any deviation from the agreement would be met with full force. Iran's semi-official media reported that oil tanker passage through the Strait of Hormuz, which had briefly resumed, was halted again specifically because of Israel's fresh strikes in Lebanon. The economic relief the world had just experienced was already under threat. Egypt, which had helped mediate the ceasefire, accused Israel of a premeditated attempt to undermine the agreement. Pakistan's Prime Minister Sharif called on all parties to exercise restraint and respect the ceasefire terms. The White House then released its own clarification that deepened the confusion further. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirmed to reporters that the U.S.-Iran ceasefire does not apply to Israel's operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon. This directly contradicted what Pakistan's mediating team had publicly announced. Vice President J.D. Vance, speaking from Budapest, attempted to explain the discrepancy by saying he believed the Iranians thought the ceasefire included Lebanon and it just didn't. He described it as a legitimate misunderstanding. Vance added that Israel had agreed to show some restraint in Lebanon but provided no specifics on what that restraint would look like, given that Israel had just launched the largest strike package of the war hours earlier. A senior analyst at King's College London described the overall situation as a very ambiguous ceasefire agreement that is extremely shaky and brittle. That assessment proved accurate within the first 12 hours of the agreement taking effect. To understand why the Lebanon question is so explosive, it helps to look at what Iran actually put on the table in its 10-point proposal. According to Iranian officials and statements from Iran's Supreme National Security Council, the proposal includes the lifting of all international sanctions against Iran and the release of frozen Iranian assets held overseas. It calls for the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from military bases across the region. It demands compensation and reparations for damage caused during the war. It requires an end to all hostilities against what Iran calls the axis of resistance, meaning groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. It calls for Iran's right to nuclear enrichment to be recognized. And it demands that any final agreement be codified through a binding United Nations Security Council resolution. These are not minor adjustments to the existing regional order. Several of these demands represent fundamental shifts in U.S. Middle East policy that Washington has resisted for decades. The U.S. had previously submitted its own 15-point proposal to Iran through Pakistani intermediaries. That proposal made clear that Iran could never have nuclear weapons and called for the complete dismantlement of Iran's ballistic missile program. Iran rejected that proposal outright. Trump said on Wednesday that many points of the American proposal have already been agreed to but did not specify which ones. He also posted on Truth Social that there will be no enrichment of uranium and that the United States will work with Iran to remove all deeply buried nuclear material. Iran has consistently said its nuclear program and its missile capabilities are not negotiable. These gaps between the two sides are not cosmetic. They are fundamental. And 2 weeks is an extraordinarily short window to bridge them. One of the most immediate consequences of the war and one of the most powerful leverage points Iran has held throughout this conflict is control over the Strait of Hormuz. Since the war began in late February, Iran effectively turned the strait into a chokehold on the global energy supply. Tanker traffic was severely disrupted. Nations that depend on Gulf oil were forced to seek emergency alternatives. The disruption sent energy costs surging across Europe, Asia, and beyond. The ceasefire announcement briefly reversed that. Oil prices fell sharply on the news. Shipping companies began recalculating routes. Iran confirmed that safe passage through the strait would be allowed for the 2-week ceasefire period via coordination with Iranian armed forces. Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency reported that Iran and Oman were discussing charging transit fees for vessels passing through the strait during the ceasefire with funds earmarked for reconstruction costs. That detail drew sharp attention from analysts because it suggests Iran views control over the strait not just as a wartime weapon but as a long-term economic and strategic asset. When Iranian media then reported that tanker passage was halted again following Israeli strikes in Lebanon, the fragility of the entire arrangement became impossible to ignore. The strait is not just a diplomatic issue. Every hour it remains disrupted costs the global economy in measurable and significant ways. That economic pressure is one of the few things that brought both Washington and Tehran to the point of a ceasefire agreement at all. And Netanyahu's Lebanon operations are now directly threatening to undo it. The situation in Lebanon deserves its own examination because it is not simply a side conflict. It is central to everything that is happening right now. Lebanon was drawn into this war on March 2 when Hezbollah launched strikes against Israel in response to Khamenei's killing on the first day of the US-Israel campaign against Iran. Israel responded with airstrikes across Lebanon and then with a ground invasion of southern Lebanon aimed at establishing what it calls a security buffer zone. According to Lebanese authorities, more than 1,500 people have been killed since the war expanded to Lebanon and more than 1.2 million people have been displaced. Israeli forces have pushed as far as 6 miles into Lebanese territory. The Israeli government has stated it will not withdraw its ground forces and will not allow displaced Lebanese civilians to return to their homes until Hezbollah is fully disarmed. Hezbollah for its part said after the ceasefire announcement that it was halting its own attacks on Israel to give mediators a chance to secure a broader agreement covering Lebanon. But a Hezbollah official also made clear that the group will not accept a return to the pre-March situation where Israel conducted near-daily strikes inside Lebanon while a nominal ceasefire was supposed to be in place. The official said Hezbollah will not accept for the Israelis to continue behaving as they did before this war. The Lebanese government told citizens readying to return home to wait. Lebanese state media confirmed airstrikes on Tyre on Hezbollah-affiliated paramedics and Israeli artillery attacks on multiple villages across the south. Israel also issued fresh evacuation orders for Beirut's southern suburbs in the same hours that Netanyahu was telling the world the ceasefire was a step in the right direction. Netanyahu's declaration that this is not the end of the campaign, but a step along the way tells you something important about how Israel is approaching this moment. Israel views the 2-week ceasefire as an operational pause, not a strategic endpoint. The objectives Netanyahu referred to are likely multiple. Completing the degradation of Hezbollah's military infrastructure in Lebanon. Ensuring that any final agreement with Iran includes binding commitments on Iran's nuclear program and ballistic missile capabilities. And preventing Iran from reconstituting the axis of resistance network that has for years projected Iranian power across the region through proxy forces. A senior Israeli official confirmed to reporters that the United States has given Israel assurances that Washington will insist during negotiations on the removal of enriched uranium from Iran, the end of further enrichment, and the elimination of the ballistic missile threat. These are the outcomes Israel most wants from this process. And Israel's continued military pressure, particularly in Lebanon, appears to be a way of ensuring those demands remain central to any deal rather than being negotiated away in exchange for a quicker agreement. The risk of this approach is significant. Iran has already warned that continued Israeli strikes in Lebanon could cause it to close the Strait of Hormuz again and resume operations against American allies in the region. Iran's Supreme National Security Council said explicitly that its hands are on the trigger, and the moment the enemy makes the slightest mistake it will be met with full force. That is not diplomatic language. That is a warning that the ceasefire could collapse within days if the situation in Lebanon continues to escalate. Despite all the turbulence on the ground, the next critical moment in this story is the scheduled start of negotiations in Islamabad on Friday, April 10. US and Iranian officials are expected to sit down under Pakistani mediation for the first time in what could be the most consequential diplomatic process in the Middle East in decades. American and Iranian heads of state have not met in person since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Vice President J.D. Vance is expected to lead the U.S. delegation. The gaps between the two sides going into those talks are enormous. The U.S. says there will be no uranium enrichment. Iran says enrichment is a non-negotiable right. The U.S. wants Iran's ballistic missiles dismantled or severely constrained. Iran says its missile program is not on the table. The U.S. wants Iran to end its support for regional proxy groups. Iran's 10-point proposal demands that all hostilities against those same groups cease. These are not negotiating positions that can be split down the middle in 2 weeks. Analysts who have studied previous US-Iran diplomatic efforts note that both sides have a long history of approaching negotiations with fundamentally incompatible baseline assumptions. The 2015 nuclear deal took nearly 2 years of intensive back-channel work before producing an agreement. And that agreement ultimately collapsed. The Islamabad talks are starting with less preparation, more mutual distrust, and a far more complex set of demands on both sides. What makes this moment different from previous diplomatic efforts is the sheer weight of what has already happened. A sitting Iranian supreme leader has been killed. Iran has lost significant military infrastructure. The Strait of Hormuz has been weaponized against the global economy. More than 1,500 people have died in Lebanon alone. The human and economic cost of returning to full-scale conflict is now visible and documented in a way that was not true before the war began. That reality creates pressure on both sides to find some form of agreement, even if it falls far short of what either side wants. There is a dimension to this story that tends to get lost in the daily cycle of ceasefire announcements and strike reports. The Iran war did not begin with a single provocation. It is the product of decades of unresolved conflicts compounding on top of each other. The unresolved Palestinian question. Iran's nuclear ambitions. Israel's security doctrine of preemptive action. America's shifting relationship with the region. Saudi Arabia's quiet realignment toward normalization with Israel. The slow erosion of international institutions capable of mediating major power conflicts. Netanyahu's statement that the ceasefire does not bind Israel is not simply a tactical military decision. It reflects a deeper strategic reality. Israel does not believe that a US-Iran deal of any kind will by itself remove what it views as existential threats. Hezbollah remains armed and embedded in Lebanon. Hamas still exists as a political and military organization. Iranian ballistic missiles can still reach Israeli cities. Iran's nuclear program remains active. From Israel's perspective, signing on to a ceasefire that leaves all of those threats in place is not security. It is delay. There is a dimension to this story that tends to get lost in the daily cycle of ceasefire announcements and strike reports. The Iran war did not begin with a single provocation. It is the product of decades of unresolved conflicts compounding on top of each other. The unresolved Palestinian question. Iran's nuclear ambitions. Israel's security doctrine of preemptive action. America's shifting relationship with the region. Saudi Arabia's quiet realignment toward normalization with Israel. The slow erosion of international institutions capable of mediating major power conflicts. Netanyahu's statement that the ceasefire does not bind Israel is not simply a tactical military decision. It reflects a deeper strategic reality. Israel does not believe that a US-Iran deal of any kind will by itself remove what it views as existential threats. Hezbollah remains armed and embedded in Lebanon. Hamas still exists as a political and military organization. Iranian ballistic missiles can still reach Israeli cities. Iran's nuclear program remains active. From Israel's perspective, signing on to a ceasefire that leaves all of those threats in place is not security. It is delay. That perspective does not make the ongoing strikes in Lebanon less devastating for the civilians caught in them. The people of southern Lebanon who spent weeks displaced and were preparing to go home heard Netanyahu's statement and stopped. One resident in Sidon told reporters he and his family had their bags packed and were ready to go back to Nabatee. But after Netanyahu spoke, they decided to wait. He said they would be targeted if they went home. That is not an abstraction. That is what a ceasefire that does not include Lebanon means for the people living under it. No honest analysis of this situation can offer a clean resolution. The 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran is real, but it is also deeply conditional. It rests on Iran keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. It rests on Israel not pushing Iran past the point where Tehran feels it has no choice but to resume operations. It rests on the Islamabad talks producing enough progress to justify extending the window. And it rests on Netanyahu accepting that some Israeli objectives will need to be deferred to the diplomatic process rather than pursued militarily during the ceasefire period. Every one of those conditions is currently under strain. What Netanyahu's statement revealed is that Israel intends to use the next 2 weeks not as a pause in its military campaign but as a continuation of it in Lebanon while the rest of the world focuses on the US-Iran diplomatic track. Whether Iran accepts that interpretation or whether it eventually decides that American assurances about Lebanon are insufficient to keep the broader ceasefire alive is the central question of the next 14 days. The war between the United States, Israel and Iran has cost over 1,500 lives in Lebanon alone since it expanded to that front. It has disrupted global energy markets in ways still being counted. It has brought the Middle East to a moment of genuine uncertainty about what the regional order will look like when the dust settles. And it has produced a ceasefire that within hours of being announced was already being tested by the same forces that started the conflict in the first place. Netanyahu said the finger remains on the trigger. Iran said the same. Trump said the deal is a total and complete victory. The people of southern Lebanon said they cannot go home. That is where things stand. And the next 2 weeks will determine whether this moment becomes the beginning of a genuine diplomatic process or simply the eye of a storm that is still very much in motion.